Hi, Shivaji.
Hello. I just sent you an email.
You did? All right, I'll check it right after this. Yeah, I just finished the blog post with all about you. It should go up on the blog tonight.
Okay.
In fact, it may already be there now. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Hey, Ron.
Hello, Ron.
Hey, how are you?
Okay.
Well, it's good. Actually, Andy gave me a haircut.
I know, I saw on Facebook. It looks good.
It's amazing. She's
It looks
done a
amazing.
job. Amazing what you can do with YouTube.
So is that something they taught her in law school, that also how to cut hair?
I guess, so. No, YouTube.
YouTube, okay.
Amazing.
It
Very
looks good.
talented. Next comes the dog.
Ah. Let's see how many more people are on.
Okay.
Hi.
Hey, Rebecca.
Rebecca.
Hey, Rebecca.
So nice to see everybody this time. Don't feel so alone and out here. How's it going?
Okay.
Good. I see Ron and Barbara. I see Alex. Gosh, Alex, I haven't seen you since February.
Since the winter time. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Hi, Bridget, welcome.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for joining us. I'm going to give everybody just another quick minute to get on before we get started.
And where do I find this on Facebook?
So I asked Mark to live stream it on our Facebook page. And then he's also going to send me like an MP4 of the conversation where I'll be able to put it up on YouTube. Post interview.
Cool.
Yeah. Are you at home right now?
I am, yeah. So I go to the Eastern Action Network's page to find it?
Yes.
Cool. This is awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've been doing a lot of these, huh?
Not Facebook Live. No, I've done a lot of Zoom stuff for sure. I just got off a fundraiser, but haven't done a lot of Facebook Live.
I did have people send in questions beforehand. The last one that we did, I've actually lost you. Hold on. The last one that we did, we were having some technical difficulties taking questions live. So for this one, we asked everyone to send in their questions beforehand. And if it works out that we can take some live questions as well, that would be great. I was really happy with the response we got. A lot of people have questions for you and they want to get to know you. So
Oh, good.
yeah, it is good. So I think if you're ready, I'd like to get started.
Sure.
Okay, great. So welcome back, everyone who's joining us tonight. So nice of you to be here for another, what we call In Conversation from the Eastern Action Network. Our guest today is County Legislator Bridget Fleming, who's running in the Democratic primary for Congress. I'm going to give you a quick bio. Legislator Fleming was elected to the Suffolk County Legislature for the 2nd Legislative District in 2015. Her primary policy focuses on protecting and preserving the environment, public health, and responsible economic development. We're excited to talk about all of those things tonight, so thank you again in your flexibility for joining us. We've had to reschedule this, I think, twice now, so we appreciate you being here. Did we lose you? No, you're here. I can't see you anymore, though. Oh, there you are. Okay. So our group had the opportunity to host you at one of our meetings in the fall when you were running for re-election. And a number of members were intrigued not only by what you accomplished in the legislature, but your ease and demeanor with the group, I think came across really well that night. And I think we had a few people ask you why you weren't running for Congress. So It's nice to be here with you running for Congress today. We have a lot to get to, including those questions that I mentioned from people who emailed me. So let's go ahead and get started. Your bio is very interesting, very impressive. I love that you include your dog Dune as amongst your family members. I think that speaks strongly to the content of your character. Say that again, Bridget.
I was muted. I'm not dumb. Dune gets me a lot of votes, so I try to keep her up front and center.
That's fair. I'd like to start at the beginning. In looking at your bio, it's clear that you started out with an attraction towards public service, and I'm wondering where that came from. Was there a seminal event or maybe a person in your childhood who sort of sparked your interest in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't get asked that often, but I come from a family that is very public service oriented. My father was a pension fund
there's a shitload of people.
for a labor union, and I have 7 brothers and sisters, most of whom became teachers. A couple of us became lawyers, but almost everyone is involved in some way in public service. I was raised very Catholic and kind of, I don't know if people are familiar with Dorothy Day, but in this sort of a mold of spirituality being something that leads you to service to other people in the community. So it's just something that in my family zeitgeist, it's just sort of the way you live your life. It's the most satisfying way to live your life. I think it's probably also my personality. I just have always found it much more satisfying to try to make the world a better place than to, focus on individual concerns. So, I mean, even when I was in law school, I spent 1 year before law school at a corporate law firm, establishing residence in Virginia, because then I went to Virginia Law School, but also just trying to figure out whether, what kind of law I wanted to do. And I knew from that, the experience is a very nice firm, but I knew from that experience that corporate law, serving private interests in the legal world was just not something that was satisfying to me, and that I was much more likely to be someone who wanted to do public interest and public service work. So actually, when I was in law school, I focused on helping develop a program that would allow people who went into public service to get their loans forgiven. And I actually won an award at graduation that I didn't expect to win from the faculty because of that effort, because it changed things a lot at the University of Virginia, that, people had a lot less debt if they committed themselves to working in the public sector. I didn't qualify because I went into the district attorney's office, and that wasn't considered public interest at that time. But yeah, it's always been something that's been the way I like to lead my life.
So I want to talk about that because you worked for almost a decade as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, as a member of the sex crimes prosecution unit, and later as chief of a unit devoted to attacking fraud in public programs.
Right.
Can you tell us more about your time there, and specifically how those years informed your approach towards policy and public service today? And just as a reminder, and when people are coming on the call, if you could just please mute your end of it so we can hear Bridget's responses clearly.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to serve in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office under Robert Morgenthau, who was there for many decades and had a reputation as being a real straight shooter, someone who did not use District Attorney's Office for political gain. He was sort of above the fray, and especially when I was a chief of a unit, he would routinely ask me when I asked for guidance, because it was sort of a high-profile unit. We were trying to clean up some corruption in Medicaid, welfare, and housing, public housing. I would ask him, "Do we want to do this?" And he would say, "Is there a crime?" I'd say, "Yes." "Can you prove it?" "Yes." "Well, then yes, you do it. And if there's not, then you don't." I had a case once where a young girl, she came to the grand jury in her parochial school uniform. She had been cut. It was back in the day when they used, there were these popular crimes where people use box cutters to injure people, and it happened in a housing project, and this girl was very young. The defendant was also a young girl, a little bit older than she. But at the very beginning, the girl who did the crime said that she was acting in self-defense. And we were unable to interview her because her lawyer was a young lawyer who didn't want to take the chance of having us talk to her. And so asked for her, right not to incriminate herself. And so I had to go into the grand jury. I had a young woman with over 200 stitches in her face. But from the moment we indicted the case, we started our own investigation. And my bureau chief and I, along with some investigators, went out and did the work ourselves because the legal aid lawyer didn't feel like she wanted to give us that information. So we did it ourselves. After a number of months, we determined that in fact the defendant was correct, that she was acting in self-defense. The girl who was injured, her brother had a gun and threatened the defendant with a gun. So it was a perfect case of self-defense. It was actually true. And even though it's very difficult once a grand jury has voted for an indictment to ask that the indictment be dismissed, because there's a certain amount of import, of course, that's put in an indictment, we went to the judge with the support of Mr. Morgenthau and the head of the trial division, and did something called a dismissal on recommendation of the prosecutor, and asked that be dismissed, even though the victim had over 200 stitches in her face. It was a grisly crime, but it wasn't a crime because there was a legitimate self-defense defense. So I only bring that up because I think that, district attorneys throughout the country have different reputations, but that was sort of a really emblematic moment in my career at the DA's office, that my bosses really wanted to know what happened out there. It's not always easy to determine, but the last thing we wanted to do was prosecute an innocent person. And so even though the defense was not working with us, we went out of our way to get it right, and the bosses all supported that. So those two things kind of define what I took from the DA's office. One being Mr. Morgenthau's commitment to doing the right thing regardless of politics, and the other being my bosses in difficult situations supporting my desire to ensure that we're doing justice and not just, notches on the belt or to get convictions or indictments. And so that sort of, it informed the way that I've approached a lot of things, because even in the most difficult circumstances, I think you got to just sort of reach deep and have the courage to make the tough choices to ensure that you're doing the right thing. And so I felt really blessed. It was a great, great job. Some of the best trial lawyers on both sides, on the defense and the prosecution, in that office, in that courthouse. I learned so much from them. I can't wait to debate Lee Zeldin, because I learned a lot about debates and cross-examination and summations from my time in the DA's office. And I think I can do a good job holding Lee Zeldin accountable in a debate.
It's nice to hear a story like that, because they seem few and far between. Not just that you have a boss that encouraged you to do the right thing, but a male boss who encouraged you to do the right thing as a female employee. So it's nice to hear.
Yeah.
You really answered my next question, which was, what were there certain skills that you took away from that position that were helpful for you in the legislature? You mentioned, your ability to debate. Was there anything else maybe you wanted to mention?
The other thing that I think of a lot that I learned from the DA's office, both being line assistant and also being a boss is how quickly you have to change from fact pattern to fact pattern and just keep your feet underneath you and make good, strong decisions, because the same thing happens on the legislature. You know, you have these complex pieces of legislation. The world moves very, very quickly. You have to be able to cast the right votes. You need to make the right amendments. You need to be nimble in terms of who you want to bring on board as an ally, or how you count up the votes to get a piece of legislation passed. All those things require being really quick on your feet and very nimble intellectually, and certainly was something I learned in the DA's office. The other thing I learned is don't really sweat the small stuff, because there's always another crisis around the corner. So it was, you know, we were so busy and life was so challenging for the victims, for, you know, everyone involved, that you really sort of had to keep your head on your shoulders, not get carried away with any one particular thing, because you knew there was going to be another on the other side. And I think that is really important for leadership in the political realm, especially now. I mean, this coronavirus is so challenging. I mean, every day I'm talking to people who are devastated, whether it's economically, food insecurity, scared of their health, having lost someone. It's just the widespread devastation of this virus is very, it has a big impact on individuals who are trying to help people. But you have to just be able to absorb things to a certain extent, not get too tied into any, you know, not to get thrown off track when things get difficult. I guess that's the best way of saying it, because right now, day in and day out, coronavirus is making life difficult for everyone. And so you have to stay on track, stay on task, and keep your wits about you. And I think I learned that at the DA's office.
Sure, we definitely have some questions for you about coronavirus and the pandemic. But I want to ask, before we move on to that, a little bit more about your having worked closely with law enforcement. I'm wondering if you feel like that sets you apart from the other Democratic candidates in this race at all.
I do. You know, actually, the reason why I worked at the DA's office is because I ran into Robert Morgenthau on a train. I was sitting in the dining car on the Amtrak train coming from Charlottesville to Washington, D.C. The winter holiday of my first year in law school, and I was seated across from Mr. Morgenthau. I didn't know who he was. We got into a long conversation. I tend to talk a lot, and we just talked and talked, and he ended up writing his name and phone number on my Amtrak ticket stub and inviting me to work for the office. So I had never intended to go into criminal prosecution, and as a matter of fact, there are a number of people in my family who were very disappointed that I did that, because they tend to be very progressive thinkers. But I do think that the skills that I learned and the things that I just talked about, and thank you for giving me that opportunity, you know, made it one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life. And so on the one hand, you know, I have that. I certainly have the public speaking skills and the skills of sort of taking a punch, rolling with the punches, being able to hold people accountable. But on the other hand, just from a practical standpoint, you know, there is a slightly Republican advantage in voter registration in CD1. It's got a large blue collar base, and you know, the appeal of someone who has the respect of law enforcement and has sort of been in the trenches with public servants is, I think, important in the race. And it's one of the reasons why folks have asked me to run this race for quite a while, because they feel that the profile of someone who has a law enforcement background is a profile that plays well in the district. So there are a number of reasons why it is an advantage, I think.
I want to talk about your eventual move from Manhattan to Long Island, but while we're on the topic, I want to ask you, because I think you're situated to talk about this well, about the confluence of law enforcement and immigration policy. You've said that immigration reform is needed. What specific reforms would you support as our Congresswoman?
Oh, for now, it's just so wide open. There's so much wrong with the system that there's a lot of room for improvement. I mean, I think I'll be frank, I don't believe in open borders. I think we need laws around immigration, but we need those laws to be fair and humane and predictably and humanely and fairly enforced. I believe we need to restore DACA, and it needs to be a clean bill without any strings attached. I think that TPS needs to be restored until we have comprehensive immigration reform. But ultimately, we need comprehensive immigration reform. We come from a district and a county where there's a lot of reliance on immigrants as people who keep the economy running. And so in that alone, it should be a universal message. And I think it is actually a bipartisan, it's an appealing bipartisan message to move forward with comprehensive immigration reform, because it's so important to the economy, because it's so deeply broken. Those of us who are appalled by the inhumanity of the way the immigration system is run right now of course want to see reforms, but I think it also appeals to people who are more to the center and want to see it for for economic reasons. The crisis at the border with children in cages is astonishing and inhumane to the extreme, just unconscionable. We are not a community that should be supporting or even tolerating, much less implementing such cruel policy. I mean, because the Trump administration enacted these rules like the detaining of families and the separation of children in order to send a message to the countries that are, that produce immigrants to our country. So in effect, it is cruelty as a policy. It is conscious cruelty to send a message. That is not the American way. And I will fight tooth and nail when I get to Congress to change it. That's one place where I think replacing Lee Zeldin, even if you did nothing else when you got in Congress, just by replacing Lee Zeldin with his race baiting and, to this day, continuing to drum up race hatred will be an advance by his not being there. I will take it further because I am a strong supporter of comprehensive immigration reform for the reasons I've outlined. But I think the first thing we need to do is get rid of Lee Zeldin and his support for Donald Trump's inhumane immigration policies.
Well, I think most people here would certainly agree with you on that. I was reading Pierre put out a great survey for all of the candidates. And when asked if you oppose municipalities honoring administrative warrants from ICE, your response was, quote, law enforcement agencies need to be able to work together so trust can be built at the same time that immigrant communities are not victimized and abused. So I'm wondering if today you could give us a specific example of what that balance looks like, perhaps in relation to the ICE raids that have happened here in our district in the past 4 years since Trump has been in office.
Well, I served on the Public Safety Committee. I'm now the vice chair of the Public Safety Committee, but I served on that committee when our prior sheriff was in office and was honoring administrative warrants. He held to the line that the county attorney interpreted the law to require that he honor those warrants. In fact, now we know that there's been case law that's established that that's not the case, that administrative warrants are not supported by the probable cause that is required to deprive an individual of their liberty. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a former prosecutor, I believe in following the law. And so I certainly support what Sheriff Toulon is doing to require a judicial warrant as opposed to an administrative warrant in order to detain an individual beyond the time that he or she should be incarcerated, behind a local charge. That being said, I do think, and very, very importantly, I have made it really clear that it's important with that our law enforcement, the very expensive and very professional police department that we have in Suffolk County and in the local towns, not be used for civil ICE enforcement. And I think that it's really important to put those questions frequently. I will most likely be criticized by Lee Zeldin for doing that because that it may be mischaracterized to say that I want to, protect criminal immigrants or something like that. But that's not my point. My point is that we can't afford to expend our resources on civil ICE enforcement, as happens, for instance, in Texas or other communities where the 387G law is implemented and local law enforcement is required to do civil, or is deputized to do civil immigration work, and that isn't happening in Suffolk County, and I'm proud of my leadership on that issue.
Before we move on, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on the tragic killing of Ahmaud Arbery. What was your reaction when you heard what happened to this man, and how do you think we should be responding as a nation?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't hear it, I saw it. I inadvertently watched the video. I did not really, I was scrolling through my phone, and I don't know if you've seen the video, but it's horrifying. I mean, it's truly horrifying. And as a former law enforcement official, I understand one of those gentlemen was a former district attorney investigator. It's just appalling. So I'm not sure what is your specific question. I have to tell you, when I saw that video, I was just knocked off my seat because, well, a man was killed who was running away. It appears that he's running away and was killed. It's a horrible thing to see.
I guess my question was just to give you a chance to respond to what happened, and I'm wondering what you think should be our response as a nation, if anything, and maybe to comment on the local law enforcement down there, if you have any suggestions. Or,
you know what, I've been so busy since it happened. I honestly don't know. I don't know what's happening, in terms of the law enforcement steps that are being taken to investigate and prosecute the crime. But it appears that there's a homicide that happens on that video, and it needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I believe in, everybody has their rights within the criminal justice system, but in the end, brutal, senseless murder needs to be prosecuted, and the folks responsible need to be brought to justice.
Yeah. All right, maybe let's talk about something a little easier. Your transition from the city out to Southampton. When you made the move in 2001, there was a 9-year gap before you were elected to the Southampton Town Board in a special election.
Yep.
I'm wondering why you came east. I know that you had a child during that period. Did you work as well? If so, what was your focus? What did you do once you got out here?
Sure. My husband and I had decided that we wanted to leave the city. I had just met my husband, and we wanted to have a family, and we wanted to have a family outside the city. So he had worked out here. My husband grew up in Sayville, and had worked out east and had fallen in love with Sag Harbor. And so when we were looking for a place to go, we came out and looked in Sag Harbor, and we just toured around. And that day we went into a real estate agency and asked to start looking for places, and we ended up in contract in a couple of weeks in a little house that we still live in, that we still own in Noyac. And so I decided I originally got there, I actually did some criminal defense work. I worked on the indigent defense panel doing appeals, and taught yoga, especially I did have a baby soon after we got there, and we decided that I would stay home with the baby until he was ready for full-time school. So that's what I did. And then shortly after 7 years later, when he was ready for full-time school, I hung a shingle out in Sag Harbor. I started doing some litigation, some divorce work and mediation. I'm a certified mediator. And soon thereafter, I was asked to run for office. I had served on the NOYAC, what's called the NOYAC CAC, the Citizens Advisory Committee, which is a group of citizens. There are hamlets throughout Southampton town. Each hamlet has a CAC that sort of is the eyes and ears of the community to report to the town board. So I had done that while I had the baby, because that was in the evening, once a month. And then I had been asked to join a group of women who had lunch to talk about public service issues. And someone had met me through that and asked me if I would consider running for town board. Again, the background as a former criminal prosecutor is very appealing to people who are looking for leaders in the community. So they asked me to do that. I ran without any name recognition and narrowly lost. But then I knew that the person I ran as a council candidate with someone who was running for supervisor. She was on the town board. And so when she was elected supervisor, it created a vacancy. So as soon as I lost my election, I ran in a special and was elected to the town board. And so that was in March of 2010, and I was on the town board for 6 years.
Yeah, 2015 was when you won your first term on the legislature.
Right.
In that time since, you've secured millions for clean water and infrastructure, which I know is one of your focuses and passions. It's also an issue that feels really unifying to me as it pertains to constituents in the district. What are the specific environmental and infrastructure issues you've worked on? And if elected to Congress, what more will you be able to do pertaining to those issues?
I'm so glad you asked, because it's such a rich area. It's so critically important to our economy and to our way of life. So to begin with, clean water has been one of my big focuses since I was on the town board. But we have two issues with regard to water, critical issues in Eastern Long Island. One being the red tide and nitrification, which has been an issue since 1985, was when the shellfish industry collapsed. The clams in the Great South Bay completely collapsed in 85, mostly because of the red tide. And at that time, people had talked about the fact that this was nitrogen pollution. Nitrogen is a naturally occurring part of our ecosystem. It's not by itself a pollutant, but in overabundance, it tends to lead to low dissolved oxygen, lower the vegetation, subsurface vegetation disappears, wetlands are destroyed, and finfish and shellfish can't survive. So we've known that since 1985. It's been a problem, but nobody's really taken it on until recently. And so I was a member of the working group on the legislature that wrote the first sanitary code revisions in 30 years to allow for the nitrogen removing sanitary systems. I also helped to ensure that hundreds of millions of dollars worth of sewer infrastructure was approved and by the voters as well as by the legislature. And so those things working in combination, these individual systems and the sewers, we hope will reverse the red tide. We've already seen some progress on that. And also the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, which is also devastating, closes beaches. A dog in my district actually died having who swam in a pond that had the blue-green algae. So serious problems there. And we need infrastructure funding to continue from the federal government to continue both with the sewering and where it's not appropriate with the other systems. Really importantly, in the individual systems, our county controller, who at the time was running against the Democratic County Executive, Steve Bellone, pulled a really partisan stunt by issuing 1099 forms to individuals who had received grants to support their installing these nitrogen removing systems, which can cost $40,000. And we had not I, but the administration had plenty of support for the way they structured the delivery of the loans. They go to the vendor, not to the individual homeowner, in order to ensure that the homeowner wouldn't be taxed. The vendors pay the taxes. But John Kennedy, who, as I say, was at the time running against Steve Bellone, decided to also tax the homeowner. It's really astounding. And he even went as far as asking the IRS for an opinion as to whether this was true. Now, if you want to ask whether the Trump White House is going to ask for, and the Trump IRS commissioner is going to support taxing homeowners in order to undermine an environmental program, I think you probably know what the answer is. And sure enough, they did support the taxing. That's one of the first things I'll do when I get to Capitol Hill, is to start to draft legislation that will clearly, clearly explain that these grants should not be taxed, just like solar grants are not taxed. I mean, it's pretty easy fix, but Lee Zeldin hasn't touched it because it was implemented by a close Republican ally of his. The other question, other than the nitrogen, is groundwater contamination. So 1,4-dioxane and the PFOS, PFOA, perfluorinated compounds, which are considered emerging contaminants that are appearing more and more in our groundwater, they trigger some really important action that's needed on the local and the federal level. On the local level, we need to ensure that folks who have private wells or don't have access to safe drinking water are supported with infrastructure to run mains to their homes and to make sure that they have a safe drinking water supply. That's something that we need to do in conjunction with the federal government, because as you know, infrastructure funding has to be supported by the federal government, whose resources are so much more vast than ours here at home. So that's something that needs to be stepped up. The other thing that's really important on that issue on Capitol Hill is that the EPA has been underfunded. And Lee Zeldin himself has voted to strip $50 million in funding from the EPA. He supports Donald Trump's administrator of the EPA, who is a climate denier, a former coal industry lobbyist. And we haven't seen them, so because of that, we haven't seen the EPA be able to step up in, for instance, this area of groundwater contamination, where we need clear standards for 1,4-dioxane and for the perfluorinated compounds. Because the EPA, which normally would act in this area, has not acted in this area, I've advocated strongly for New York State to take it on. And sure enough, New York State has done that, and they're currently preparing to rule on what they call maximum contaminant loads for these contaminants, so that, which would trigger two things. One thing, it informs the public so that people will know, at what level do you get sick from these, and the second, that knowing that, relying on the science of it, would allow us to take smart policy steps to ensure that people have safe drinking water with infrastructure and environmental protections. So those things are being completely underserved. We are being completely underserved in those areas by the federal government. Lee Zeldin is not acting on it. Donald Trump is certainly not acting on it. And so that's another area where if you have someone other than Lee Zeldin there, you're going to have the needs and concerns of Long Island much more vigilantly served than they are being right now. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it definitely did. And I have a question. I don't know if it's opening a Pandora's box, but Lee Zeldin really touts himself as such an environmental advocate to this district. How do you think he gets away with these things with his constituents that support him?
I mean, is that on us a little bit, maybe, that we don't? Well, certainly not. I know you all work very hard to advocate, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to step into the race, is because Lee Zeldin needs to be held accountable for the fact that he's not an environmentalist. Look, the League of Conservation Voters gives him a ranking of 9 out of 100. 9 out of 100. So, for years, he has claimed to be a centrist, whether it's supporting economic needs of the middle class or women's rights or environmental policy, and the voting record just isn't there. Whether it's the votes to strip the funding from the EPA, whether it's refusing to stand up for homeowners when they're being double taxed for their septic systems, whether it's supporting a climate denier, whether it's not moving forward on setting standards for groundwater contamination. I mean, we could, just talking briefly, these are things that are right there at the top of the list for Long Island communities, and are not being pursued by our congressional representatives. So he cannot claim the mantle of an environmentalist. The League of Conservation Voters knows that. In the general election, that's going to be our job, to ensure that the public knows that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of you making it to Capitol Hill, there's been much discussion over your decision to throw your hat into this primary race. Why did you decide to run, and why did you decide to announce when you decided to announce?
Well, we just talked a little bit about my focus on environmental policy, and I think my team and I have done an awful lot for our community, not only in environmental policy, but certainly there. I mean, in this past race, Newsday said I'm one of the most effective and active legislators. So, and we also need to keep our Democratic majority on the county legislature. It's only a 2-year term, so you can get an awful lot done. I'm getting an awful lot done. Look at the coronavirus stuff, getting resources and information to constituents. Those are things that I think my team and I do pretty well, and we wanted to hold on to that. So I've been in office for 5 years, so I'm in my 3rd term. My first race in the county legislature was challenging. I ended up winning with 65% of the vote, but my opponent spent $250,000 against me, and it was an open seat, so that was a really tough race. But the next time that I ran, and by the way, these are alternating, so the county term is 2 years and alternates with the congressional term, which is 2 years. So the election was 19 for the county, and then 20 for congressional. So it's very tough. People have asked me to run this race for a long time, and it's kind of tough to work out that timing. I believe that we are best served at this very high level of congressional representation by someone who has the experience and the knowledge, having, and a record, has actually done things for the community. And so I think it's a difficulty in the system that, in order to run as a lower level elected official, you've got to, make these decisions. Anna Throneholz quit her job, as supervisor. My two opponents are doing, are both, well, I don't know about, actually, I shouldn't say that. I know Nancy Goroff, took a sabbatical to do the race. I don't think that's the way it should work. I think we should have representatives who are in the trenches, who have proven records, who have relationships that can be brought to bear for the benefit of the community. So I'm sorry, the first race was a tough one. The next time I ran, they put a placeholder up against me. And I won, I had 65% of the vote again, but I didn't really have a tough race. So we were thinking that that's what I would be able to do in 19. And then the Republican Party put a former Republican supervisor up against me in the challenge for my recent reelection. So I had to put all my attention in preserving the Democratic majority and keeping our good work going before I could start raising money or announce that I was going to run for Congress. I wasn't sure that I would be able to, but then when I saw, well, first of all, even though I ran against a former supervisor, fairly popular former supervisor, I did once again get more than 60% of the vote. So it's clear that folks who know my work appreciate it and want me to keep, serving the community. And then also I looked at Steve Ballone's numbers countywide, and I sat down with Steve Ballone, the county executive, shortly after the election, and took a look at his numbers. He won Brookhaven with 53% of the vote. And looking at the map, I now hired Steve's field director, Mark Gornache, is my campaign manager, because we want to see that we could just bring those votes across the finish line again against Lee Zeldin. But when we looked at it, we looked at the map, we said, this is very doable. But then I looked at, for instance, Perry Gershon, who I have nothing against. I admire him. I think that he's, very good on policy. But look, in a very good year for Democrats, when we flipped the House, we left this one on the table. Perry had the resources he needed. He worked very hard. He made his case to the voters. It was a good year for Democrats, and he came up short. It's not to say, it's not any judgment, it's just a recognition of history. And so I also did not have confidence that Nancy Goroff, with her limited exposure, and no public office background, would be able to do it too. This is going to be a very, very tough race against Lee Zeldin. In this last quarter, I raised $250,000, even though we were in the coronavirus. I outraised Perry considerably. I outraised Nancy as well. So, the three of us I raised $250,000, they raised less. Lee Zeldin raised $614,000 in that same quarter during Corona. Mm-hmm. So, not that money is everything, but we have to be very realistic about how tough this is. But it's doable, and it should have happened in 18. So that's why when I saw my good results in the last race, when people were saying to me, you really need to step up, the stakes are too high, I felt I couldn't stay on the sidelines.
No, I appreciate your honesty surrounding that answer. And I also find it to be a smart one, just in terms of wanting to protect your seat, but then also knowing that maybe you were called to do this as well. So let's talk about actually getting elected to Congress. You brought up Newsday. They did a poll in February that put Perry at 42% of the vote and you at 21. They attributed that to name recognition. Right. So I'd like to know what you're doing to get yourself known outside of the legislative district, wanting to know if there are other legislators that are supporting you, that are putting you in front of their districts.
Yes, actually, I have on Wednesday evening, the presiding officer, Rob Calarco, who's very popular legislator out of Patchogue, is doing a Zoom meet and greet for me on Wednesday. So come and join if you can. It'll be up on my Facebook page. And you can get the Zoom link just by, there's actually a whole list. We have a call to action this weekend. We have phone banking. There's going to be rolling trainings for phone banking on Saturday and Sunday. And, you know, then we're going to have the meet and greet with Rob on Wednesday. So everyone's welcome to that. We'd love to have you on board, because that's one of the ways we're going to do it. I'm endorsed by 6 members of the legislature, so we'll be leaning heavily on those allies and friends of mine to work in their districts, and you know, really honored to have that support. I would like to mention that I, you know, have so much support from local elected officials, which the others just don't have. Nancy has the support of one legislator who endorsed her before I got into the race, and Perry doesn't have any local electeds. Nancy is supported by scientist Congress members, but they're from outside the district. I have the endorsement of Congresswoman Kathleen Rice from here in the district, Assemblyman Fred Thiel, 3 town supervisors, 4 village mayors, many council members, 6 members of the legislature, organized labor. I mean, that really reflects the fact that I have just relationships. We've worked hard. We've been in the trenches. We've had victories. We've, you know, endured together, and we have, you know, similar goals and aspirations, you know, similar goals for the community and vision. And so those folks are going to be able to help us bring our message across. We're doing a lot of virtual work, you know, the meet and greets, the phone banking, social media, that kind of thing, and then also paid communications. I'm very proud of my communications team. I have a lot of talent on my team. We're lean and mean. We don't have as much money as the others do. We've outraised them every quarter that we've been in the race. But you know, that we're clear-eyed about the fact that we will be outspent by both Nancy Goroff and Perry Gershon, but we feel that the message is stronger, and so we're going to just be very disciplined about what our messaging is, and you know, really try to introduce me and who I really am to folks in Brookhaven. I think we can do it, and I'm looking forward to getting it done and to meeting many people. It's very disappointing to have Corona send us all indoors, because meeting people where they live and work, and you know, getting to know people throughout districts is one of the things I love the most. It's one of the reasons why Newsday calls me one of the most active legislators. I've always been a very, very hard campaigner. And so it's a little disappointing, but I spend a lot of time on the phone, a lot of time on Zoom, and, you know, we're working our networks, and we feel confident that with the very low turnout that we anticipate, you know, this is well within our reach.
If you emerge from this primary as the winner, and you end up running against Zeldin, how do you plan to tackle that race? I mean, he's just notorious for the misinformation and running a dirty campaign. How do you run an honest one against somebody like that, and who clearly has fundraising prowess?
Right. Well, there's a difference between you know, being honest and clear, and also holding someone accountable. So, you know, with my background as a former prosecutor, with my long-standing experience now as a public official, as a lawyer, I'm not shy about holding people accountable. I believe in justice. I believe in the truth. I believe in what's right. And I think one of the responsibilities of whoever wins this race is to hold Lee Zeldin accountable. We talked about it a minute ago on the environment, but on all the issues, I believe that what Donald Trump and Lee Zeldin the steps that they are taking, the policy that they put forward is destructive of our communities. And so I feel very comfortable calling that out. And that's what the campaign is going to have to do. And the voters will have to make a choice. I think, Donald Trump's popularity has waned, certainly, and for good reason. I mean, he's very vulnerable on his handling of this horrific virus, whether it's not taking it seriously, not speaking honestly to the American public, not implementing the might of the federal government to ensure that we have the supplies and the testing that we needed in our communities, not to have to turn around and shut down our entire economy. He's going to be held accountable for that. And Lee Zeldin is going to be accountable for propping him up and supporting him all these years. So I think that's how you run the race, and you've got to give it to the voters. 40% is probably not going to vote for us and stick to Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that we can't win the race, because there's a limit. I think there's a limit not only on the partisan issue, but there's also a limit on Long Island. Limited patience with politicians who are only concerned about partisan issues. When you start to forget what's important to the needs and concerns of the Long Island community, whether it's the environment, whether it's healthcare, whether it's our economy, that's when you start to lose voters. There are people who are very partisan and who are always going to stick with their guy, even especially when it's, this kind of Trump approach to very partisan government. But there's a limit to that, and there's a limit that the public is going to put up with that approach. And I think that's something that we have to make sure we're messaging and put it to the voters to stand up for themselves and not be subject to Donald Trump's attacks, like the SALT tax.
I have so many more questions for you, but I told myself I wouldn't go over an hour with my questions so that we could have time for viewers' questions. So I'm going to have to select a few out of my list before we move on. I want to know, as a woman in public office, if you've felt the effects of the president's misogyny, and if so, can you give us an example and tell us how you've handled it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's a sort of a pall over public discourse these days that's supported by the president, that is biased, that supports a really sort of a rhetoric that is unfair to people who are different from him. I think he's really rough on women and people of color, certainly. And so I feel like it's more of a general concern that gives license to people who want to express things that we used to not say, things cruel, things that capitalize on race, hatred, or misogyny, as you point out. I think, leadership requires guiding people toward right thinking, to supporting all members of the community. And that's missing in this administration. And I think Lee Zeldin definitely capitalizes on that and appeals to that messaging, maybe even purposefully. And so there's plenty of room for leadership to shift that. I really can't think of a personal incident myself, but I do think it's terribly destructive and needs to be reversed.
Do you consider yourself a feminist, Bridget?
I'm not sure what that means. It's a term that's taken on so many different different meanings. When you say a feminist, what do you mean by that?
Well, you actually just asked the second half of my question, which is, what is your definition of feminism?
Well, you know what, I have benefited from Title IX. I played tennis in college. I've benefited from a boss in Mr. Morgenthau, who intentionally hired women at a time when that wasn't the popular thing to do. So I feel that I stand on the shoulders of women who have paved the way for us to take our place in the world and to step firmly into roles of leadership. But I think there's still a long way to go. Women still make 70-something cents on the dollar, and women of color even less than that. And so, you know, that's just one example of the disadvantages that women have in the world. And so I think there's plenty of room for advocacy for women as women, whether it's in the workplace or support in terms of childcare, whether it's protecting women's right to determine their medical care and the choices they make around their own bodies. All of those things are policy areas that need intentional, courageous action. And I am committed to that. So if that's your definition of a feminist, I would say that I am a feminist.
Okay, so I know a lot of our viewers have questions surrounding the pandemic, but before we move on to those questions, I want to make sure I get this one in specifically about election security and turnout in the wake of COVID-19. How do we reach voters when we can't knock on their doors? And how do we make sure, maybe more importantly, that our elections are fair and secure?
It's a difficult question. I chair the Ways and Means Committee, and we oversee the Board of Elections, and I've asked for some reporting. I'm wary about making too many demands on the BOE right now, because they are completely overwhelmed. We're getting these news updates about when elections are going to happen, when they're not going to happen. They're going to go by mail, they're not going to go by mail. The difficulties are vast, and the funding isn't there. These changes are being made without any support for additional staffing, that sort of thing. So it is a big challenge, and I think that we've got to be very vigilant. I think it's going to take a lot of grassroots work, or what I like to say, tree roots, because grassroots is a little too shallow. We need like really serious attention and vigilance to the election system right now, because now we're going to be doing so much of voting by mail. That appears to be what's going to happen. And then at the same time, there are efforts to undermine the Postal Service and funding and staffing for the Postal Service. So, it's a vulnerability without a doubt. And with that sort of vulnerability in the election system itself, the people who are going to lose out. It's going to be people, on the lower end of the economic scale. It's going to be people of color. It's going to be people who don't have child support or other, ways of ensuring that they can take whatever steps that need to be taken to educate themselves and to figure out how you go about making sure your vote is cast. So we do have to rely on, advocates. And I hope you'll be part of that, to be vigilant and help us, because it's just confusing to begin with. But then it's also maybe very difficult to fully support a system that's going to ensure that every vote, everyone who wants to vote is permitted to vote, and that vote gets counted. I'm worried about it, and I think we should all be worried about it, keep our eye on it, and do our best to try to keep things from falling between the cracks. It's a tough situation.
Yeah, it is. Okay, I think this is a good point to move on to the questions that were sent in to me during the week for you by the constituents in our district. These are in absolutely no particular order, maybe just the way that they came in. So I'll start with the first one, which is from George Lynch. He says, that you're the only one of the primary candidates who has actual government experience. Apart from the fact that Donald Trump, who lacked such experience, has been a disaster, how important should this factor be for Democrats selecting a congressional candidate?
Well, I think there are two reasons. Thank you, George, for the question. I think there are two very clear reasons why we need leaders who are battle tested. One is Donald Trump, and two is the coronavirus. This is not a time for people to test the waters on the political fray. We need proven leaders who know how to tackle difficult challenges, all along the lines of what I was talking about, having learned at the district attorney's office. You need to be able to, we are faced with, on the one hand, a political system that has been an economic system, an environmental system, governmental system that has been really damaged by the Trump administration in a lot of ways. There's a lot of repair to do on immigration, on the environment, on women's rights, on the economy, on tax policy, on foreign policy. It's pretty ugly, and there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done. I'm really proud of my record as one of the leading legislators in terms of drafting legislation, identifying problems, understanding what allies you need to bring on board to get things accomplished within the legislative system. These are things, you know, that smart people can learn, but it takes time and effort and the right circumstances and the right mentors to learn those things. So it's super important now more than ever to have proven leadership. And it's another reason why I'm in the race. There's, on top of that, the coronavirus, and we have got to step forward. Once we get past this horrible, horrible time that we're living through, we need to step forward with a fresh eye toward how we rebuild our economy and our public health system in a way that learns the lessons of what got us here, and at the same time protects the progress that we've made in other areas, whether it's affordable housing or public transportation or public health, or infrastructure progress to support the economy. There are going to be challenges. There are going to be fights that are around what the priorities are that are going to be set. Who's going to be favored? What vision is going to be favored when we get on the other side of the virus? And if we allow special interests and big money influence to dominate our getting back on our feet in a terrible time of crisis, there are a lot of people that are going to lose out. We need champions who understand the policy, understand how to get policy enacted, and how to ensure that the policy that we do enact endures and is effective. Those things don't come to you in a flash. They don't come overnight. We can't learn on the job here. I'll be ready day one because of my background. And I think it's more important than ever with Trump and Corona in combination.
Okay, so our next one comes from Max McAuliffe, who is an LGBTQ activist, journalist, and researcher. They want to know, the only candidate in this race that has a section on LGBTQ plus issues on their campaign website is Nancy Goroff. They want to know why you don't.
You know what, I think there should be something on there on LGBTQ issues because it's something that's been very important to me. I'm thrown off because I'm thinking I'm pretty sure there is LGBTQ issues on my website. But I'll double check that because it's in the human rights section. You know, we've been moving very quickly in this race. We got in November. We've been raising money like crazy. We've been putting together our infrastructure. So if there is an oversight, it certainly does not reflect my policy. I have been a champion for many, many years. As a matter of fact, I ran against Senator Ken LaValle in 2012 because he voted no on marriage equality. I have a personal story there because my younger sister passed away in Seattle, and her partner of 9 years was not allowed in the hospital room when my sister, she died in an accident, and when she was in the hospital, my sister-in-law then testified in the Washington State Senate in support of what was then a domestic partnership bill that was the beginning of the wave that, you know, eventually ended up with this fantastic marriage equality wave that sort of swept the country. And Ken LaValle voted no on marriage equality. So I felt that field shouldn't be left untended. He shouldn't get a pass on that. So even though the Democratic Party didn't want me to run, Ken LaValle is considered, you know, I've worked with him quite a bit, and you know, he was a very good senator, but I just felt you can't let that go. And so it was a very, very tough race. I won in, you know, some of the towns, but I got pretty well beat up in other parts of Ken LaValle's district, as you can imagine. But I was proud to run that race for that one issue because I thought it was just too important. So I'm very, very committed to LGBTQ rights, and you know, we'll take a look at the website. I wasn't aware of that.
Thank you. Thanks for your support on that. And I'm sorry about your sister.
Oh, thank you. She was lovely, but you know, everything happens for a reason. I don't usually bring that up, but it's near and dear to my heart. She was a lovely person.
So our next question comes from Mike Anthony. He writes, one of the most pressing issues before many residents of CD1 is the inability to pay rent and mortgages due to the loss of income resulting from the coronavirus. In March, Governor Cuomo imposed a 90-day moratorium on rent payments, and the federal government is limiting evictions if mortgages are supported through various federal programs. However, the need is greater than currently available, so U.S. House of Representative Ilhan Omar has introduced legislation to provide support to landlords and mortgage holders from financial losses due to the coronavirus. The question is, would you support this type of legislation or other proposals to assist renters and homeowners?
Well, I think it's critically important to assist renters and homeowners without a doubt. And it brings up the importance of the federal government not punishing blue states and supporting state and local governments who've been fighting on the front lines of coronavirus. So I have advocated for the kind of funding that we need to support our local communities. On housing, in particular, I am meeting with the local housing authorities in my district to figure out ways that they can survive if their renters are unable to pay their rent. So we want to make sure that those renters in these housing authority programs don't lose their homes or are not penalized for not being able to pay rent because they're not working out of no fault of their own. And we're pursuing in COVID-3 and COVID 3.5, there's monies that were designated to go to various agencies without local government asking for it. It's very complex, and so it's taking a lot of research to figure out, and we're working with economic development commissioners as well as these local authorities to ensure that that funding gets applied to the renters who may be unable to pay their rent, and that the housing authorities are still going to be able to function without that revenue. So that's one of the places where I think we have to look at the incredible strain that this stay-at-home order and the coronavirus have put on individuals who may have difficulty paying their rent or paying their mortgage. I put a bill into the legislature to look at the possibility of waiving penalties or fees or various county like license fees, that kind of thing, if there's a way for small businesses, and that would include the rent as well, certain rent penalties. So yeah, we've got to be very clear-eyed about this. This is going to be an expansive kind of devastation that's going to ripple through the economy if we don't support people in their homes and keep them in their homes. So I'm all for exploring solutions to find relief for not only for the renters, but also for landlords who, like the housing authorities, are going to be hit by the revenue loss. We've got to find the support there, because otherwise it's just going to be a ripple effect.
Sort of related, one of our members at the East End Action Network, Sima Gerard, wants to know first where you stand on healthcare, if you support Medicare for all, but what impact has the pandemic had on your views about healthcare?
Well, the one thing that is very clear is that any kind of inability to access healthcare freely, quality healthcare freely, and affordable is devastating. And you certainly see it in this instance, because look, we want people to go to the doctor. If you're not feeling, or call your doctor, go on video with your doctor if you're not feeling well. We want people to be able to get tested. I was just in Southampton Hospital today because we advocated for a testing site there, which is supported in such a way that if you can't afford, if you're not insured, or you can't afford a test, that is covered, so that nobody has to not get tested because they don't have insurance. But look, we shouldn't even be in that circumstance. We should have universally accessible, affordable healthcare for every single person. I mean, that is a right, not a privilege. And we also see in a public health crisis that it is detrimental to the community as a whole if individuals, in this instance, who might be shedding a virus that can get other people sick, if those individuals don't have the ability, the financial ability to take care of themselves in a basic way, basic health care, we've got a problem as a community. And I hope, can I just mention also, this is because this is true with labor and jobs as well. I really hope that some of these things that we're seeing are problematic. Are like, for instance, not safe work conditions is what I'm saying about workers. We have this group of essential workers, right? Everybody's talking about essential workers and helping essential workers. But look, wouldn't it be nice if we had a world where every job was a secure job, every job had the kind of workplace safety assurances that would allow these folks to go to work without being worried about getting sick. So you see, for instance, labor leaders stepping up and making sure that the workforce has the PPE that they need and the workforce protections that they need. I've been in touch with, for instance, the bus drivers union, who called me to ask, the drivers are nervous of people going next to them as they get on the bus. So I called the county executive, who agreed to issue an order that says all bus boarding is from the back door. Same thing happened with the unions that assist grocery store workers, who ensure that the grocery store workers have the PPE they need, that they have masks and gloves, that some have plexiglass in front of them, that these protections are in place. I would hope, just as in the public health realm, we learn the lesson that everybody's got to have access to affordable health care. We also learn that essential workers need secure jobs that have good wages, that have good working conditions, so that we can we can have long-term health in our economy. These are the kinds of lessons that I think Corona is teaching us. I hope that we can hold on to them, and I think we need good leadership to do that.
Yeah, I do too. Sharon Adams of Eastport, another East End Action Network member, commends you on your involvement with the COVID-19 crisis. Wants to know if you can give us a brief update on the current state of our district. Also wants to know what you see as the shortfalls and failures of Lee Zeldin in protecting Long Islanders during the pandemic.
Well, I think the biggest I think the biggest fault we can find with Mr. Zeldin's representation is his support for Donald Trump, who, as I mentioned before, has so clearly mismanaged this crisis with misinformation, outright lies, not taking it seriously in time to get the states and local health departments prepared. The sort of erratic messaging, the fear-based messaging, it's just been mishandled, grossly mishandled. We've lost thousands of people. I mean, here in Suffolk County, you know, I do this little 2-minute update from time to time. I was doing it every day at the beginning of the crisis, but every day to announce the number of deaths is, you know, is really disturbing and so heartbreaking. Every day hearing about people who have died, people who have lost loved ones. It's horrifying, and you know, Donald Trump needs to be held accountable. But where we are right now, and Lee Zeldin needs to be held accountable for his support for Donald Trump.
Helen Mullen is an icon. Icons owned by them. We're in front row. And she should know better. It takes weeks, months of preparation for a 3-minute show. Can't you just put your phone away from
Oops. So I was on a government call the other day, and I thought that I was muted. Actually, it was the general meeting. I thought that I was muted, and I said, "Bye, honey, love you." And everybody was very polite, sort of ignored that. But I thought, wow, it could have been much, much worse.
They sure could have been, yeah.
But anyway, where we are right now with Corona is, you know, the stay-at-home orders are working. We are seeing hospitalizations go down. We're seeing this flattening of the curve is actually happening. The testing is ramping up. New York State has really done a good job ramping up the testing, and the county as well has done a good job ramping up the testing. I was just talking about this additional site that we just established in Southampton. But you know, it's going to be a while before we're able to safely go back to the world as normal, because you know, it is just so darn contagious, this thing, and it's really deadly. So specifically where we are, you know, we do expect that we will be able to phase in a reopening of the economy, but it's going to be a slow process. What's happening right now is there are a number of groups that are of experts and leaders that are looking at various sectors of the economy and how can we reopen. I'm on the transportation group for the county. And so there are all sorts of best practices and ensuring that you have the protections that you need in place, and lots of discussion about many complex aspects of how we slowly phase in you know, a revitalization of our economy. In order to do that, we have direction from the federal government and from New York State. We have to meet a certain number of metrics. We need to have 14 days of declines in hospitalizations. We need 14 days of decline in the increase in deaths. We need to ensure that we have 30% availability of hospital beds. We need to have a certain level of testing, and we have to have plans in place for how various economic sectors are prepared to move forward into a phased-in reopening of the economy. So we're meeting some of those. We're not meeting others. The hospitalization formula is determined on a 3-day rolling basis. We've seen the numbers bump up again over the last 2 days, so we'll have to see if it goes down again today, we're going to still be okay. Otherwise, we have to restart the clock and start another 14 days. But there are other aspects of those metrics that we are falling short on now. And so we've got to just continue to hold the course. And then we also have to make sure that the economy has the kind of support it needs so that we can at least tread water, hold on. These stimulus funds are extremely important. We have to make sure they get to the right people, which isn't always happening. And so that's something I'm very focused on is getting the resources and the information to the right people so that when, jobs can be saved, and when the economy reopens, there'll be these businesses and jobs to step back into. It's a challenge, it's a challenge, but right now, safety is key, and we need to stay the course. It's going to be hard as the weather gets better. I have a 17-year-old, so I mean, the poor thing, his lacrosse season was completely canceled. So sports is done. They haven't been able to socialize with one another. They're going crazy, and it's going to be hard to enforce the social distancing and the wearing of masks and the stepped up, the slow phase in of our getting back to community again. But we have to do it. We have to each take responsibility for that, because it's still going to be a tough and long road. But we definitely do not want to get into a place where there's a resurgence and we have to shut down the whole economy again. So we're in a tough place, but we're moving in the right direction.
That's a good segue into a question we got from Vicky Kahn. She wants to know, she's wondering how Suffolk County is planning on spending the $257 million funding from the U.S. Treasury in connection with the pandemic. What would you advocate vis-a-vis federal funding for the first district to help governments under stress?
Well, one of the biggest things has to be the government itself, and we're in the weeds on it on the legislature. Like I was, working on transportation or housing to ensure that that funding is supporting these critical parts of our economy that that have no revenue and that have to be able to survive. So, but look, there's so little that's not a critical part of our economy here. Small businesses, our real estate economy, of course, these essential public services like housing, like public transportation, the highway system, roads and bridges. Food security is critically important. Our schools are going to need additional support. I mean, the list is endless, but I'm proud of the county's effort following along with the state's advisory council of 100 people who are working in sort of groups that are addressing specific sectors of the economy and of our life to figure out how we can use those funds most efficiently and to best effect in terms of ensuring that the pieces are in place for us when we're able to move back out. It's going to take a while.
I would say, what about the post office? One of our members, Bernie Buddha, wants to know what you have to say about Trump's rejection of plans to help bail out the post office unless they raise package and delivery rates and cut labor costs. He's a resident of Remsenburg. He writes, "We don't get mail delivery, so we're very dependent on an efficient local post office for all the services they provide." He hasn't heard anything about Zeldin's position on this issue and would like to know yours.
I think we need to give full support for our post office. I think it's really the wrong time to start talking about undermining the efforts of the post office. It's an essential part of our the way the community functions. Right now we're in crisis, and that is an essential piece of communication and the economic and the movement of our economy that can't be undermined. I think it's a huge mistake. especially before the election. I think there's some, I think it's cynical to try to attack the post office when we're talking so much about voting by mail. So I'm skeptical about what the motivation is there. But I think during this crisis, when people need deliveries, when people are stuck at home, they need to be able to rely on government, quite frankly, to ensure that they have the deliveries that they need, that the mail goes through, so that those basic aspects of our economy and way of life are not disrupted. I think it's a very cynical thing to do, to attack the post office right now. You know, I fully support for our post office.
Okay, so here's a change of gears question from Shivaji. Wants to know your position on Tara Reade's accusation of Joe Biden. As a congressperson, will you aggressively protect Roe v. Wade? It's a little bit of a different question, but also encourage Me Too.
Well, sure. I mean, I'm a former sex crimes prosecutor, so I believe that women should be believed when they bring a complaint, and that then those complaints should be thoroughly investigated in a fair way. I think that we have, you know, a very difficult political system. We've come to a place in our world where politics can get very difficult, and so you know, I'm afraid I don't know what the facts are there, but I do think all women and men too, when they bring sexual assault complaints, need to be, and harassment complaints, need to be respected and listened to, and that those complaints need to be fully investigated. As far as Roe v. Wade goes, I think it's unconscionable that these congressmen signed a amicus brief asking the Supreme Court to reconsider Roe v. Wade and to consider overturning Roe v. Wade. That is a bulwark of the protections for women in the United States. It was hard fought and has been defended by you know, women, as I was saying before, on whose shoulders I stand, including my own mother. And it is critically essential for the mental health and the physical health and the economic health of women and our families that we have full control over what happens with our bodies, and that we are still talking about the potential of overturning such an important hallmark of jurisprudence that protects women's rights is just unconscionable.
This one's about the Brookhaven landfill. A big environmental, human health, and economic issue for Brookhaven town residents, particularly those who work or live nearby it. Should CD1 be able to get federal funding to help solve the looming problem? What are your thoughts about it? That's from Betsy in East Patchogue.
Yeah, and it's a great question. You know, I spent a lot of years as a town council member working on trying to get recycling not only recycling, but actually just effective and efficient handling of waste management up and running in a very difficult environment. We're on an island, and trucking waste off the island adds to carbon emissions and, you know, the use of gas, and it's a really thorny question as to what we do about our waste. But it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are lots of communities off of Long Island, elsewhere in the world, who have figured out a way to reduce the amount of material that's produced in the waste stream, and thereby not have the kind of challenges we have in terms of what to do with it. We just haven't had support at the municipal level over the years for an effective management of waste. I mean, I do give credit to the Brookhaven government with the attempts at the single stream recycling, you know, the attempts to reduce waste without having to burden the landfill or get closer and closer to the closing of the landfill. But it didn't work. And I think the question really points to a great solution to our local problems, and that is that kind of infrastructure support that we need from the federal government. The federal government has the resources and also the authority to cover, larger areas, larger combinations of municipalities in, smart environmental policy, and smart environmental policy has to include smart waste management. So yes, I do think the federal government should have a role in support for these thorny issues that Brookhaven is facing around the landfill and around what you do with the waste stream. But in the meantime, I think we do need to also take some responsibility as a local community. We need to do everything we can to reduce the amount of waste we produce. That's why I supported and co-sponsored the ban on single-use plastic bags when I was a town council member, and again in the Suffolk County Legislature, as well as the various things that Legislator Hahn has put forward to reduce single-use plastics in the waste stream. That's the best way to do it. Those 3 R's are reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle is at the very end. If we never use the materials in the first place, then we don't need the landfill. I mean, not that we don't need the landfill at all, but you need less space in the landfill. So, I feel for you if you're near that landfill. It's a tough situation. It's going to close soon. I mean, it has to. And I think it's another great area, where the EPA needs to get more involved, right? So the EPA right now is so understaffed and not supported in its environmental policy that they don't have the opportunity to implement environmental protections around waste management that they should be doing. So it's another great place that needs attention, and I'm anxious to do that when I get to Capitol Hill.
We have so many great questions that we're just not going to be able to get to tonight. So if we didn't get a chance to ask your question, I really encourage you to email Bridget, and so she can answer them one-on-one. But we'll end with this one, which is we need more than just good ideas to truly stimulate the economy and create jobs. What is your plan? But more importantly, how will you work with private enterprise, state and federal government to ensure its adoption and success?
To ensure what? I'm sorry.
It's adoption and success.
What's adoption and success?
Creating jobs. Perhaps the question is, how will you work with private enterprise, state and federal government?
Oh, to create
jobs.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's a great question. The reason why I have the support of IBEW Local 25 is because I've undertaken leadership on the county level for renewable energy, encouraging renewable energy and the development of renewable energy alternatives on Long Island. As a matter of fact, I just testified at the LIPA public comment in front of the LIPA trustees. They're about to vote on adopting community choice aggregation, which is this great model that allows communities to make choices about where their energy comes from and to get more green energy, which I hope will eventually continue to create jobs in the sector of technology and clean energy, as well as leading us toward a clean energy future. I also chair a task force that was tasked with building a map that would encourage renewable energy production on Long Island without clearing trees. And in both of those efforts, I've made sure that organized labor is at the table, so that as we're looking to create jobs in those sectors, we can ensure that those jobs are good jobs, that they have safe working conditions, good health care and wages, and a secure future for their workers. I think we have great opportunities to build jobs, to create jobs on Long Island, specifically in technology and manufacturing, specifically in manufacturing when it comes to renewable energy, not just solar, but wind as well. And who knows what else, hydro energy, bioenergy. But I do think it's very important that we work collaboratively, and I appreciate the question, because it's not job creation for a sustainable, clean economy that's going to last into the future will require input from the private sector, from organized labor, from government, from experts in the fields of that the manufacturing will be addressing. And it's in that collaboration, when all stakeholders are at the table, when everyone is working together, listening to each stakeholder and understanding their needs and concerns, that's how we build a resilient community and a resilient economy going forward. I'm excited about that as well. It's something I've worked on for many years.
Great. Well, we're so appreciative of your time tonight. I'm going to give you the last word. Anything else you'd like to say before, anything we didn't ask you that you want to talk about before we end the call tonight?
Thank you. I just want to thank you, Rebecca and Sharon as well, who invited me to this forum, and for everything you do. I mean, it is so important for us as a community to interact with one another, to listen to one another, to understand the needs and concerns of our neighbors, and to act in a thoughtful and responsible way as a community moving forward for a sustainable future for Long Island. I think this is more and more apparent as we recognize the challenges that we face because of the coronavirus. I hope that as we move forward and get past this terrible time, that we can re-envision some of the aspects of our community that are clearly vulnerable and not working for every member of the community, as we see, you know, what's happening with Corona. So I want to congratulate you as a group for being so thoughtful and for understanding that it's going to take intentionality and conscientiousness and working as a group to move us forward, but that we do have an opportunity with the right leaders in place, with the right interaction amongst all of us. We do have the opportunity to move toward a better future, a cleaner future, a future that's safer for women, that's safer for children, that includes healthcare, that doesn't include bias or you know, difficulties because you don't belong to the majority class. I think we can get there, I really do, but it's going to take intentional work and all of us working together and courageous leadership. And I want to offer that piece to you and invite you to work with the campaign if you want. Get me on the website. We've got lots of things coming up, including the call to action this weekend. So we invite you to join us, and I wish you all the best. Stay healthy, and also, you know, I do wish you all the best with East End Action Network. I think you guys are terrific, and women.
Thank you so much. We do have a good group, and if anybody would like to join our group, please send me an email to that same email that you sent your questions to. Bridget, thank you so much for your time tonight. Happy Mother's Day, and
thank you.
We'll see you in person sooner than later.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.